The U.S. Supreme Court this week struck down limits on campaign spending for political parties. The change could lead to more campaign ads on your TVs this year. Here's Josh Croup with why it matters.
Candidates for federal political office have to spend a lot of cash to win their seats. Take the last U.S. Senate race in Ohio in 2024 between Sherrod Brown and Bernie Moreno, the most expensive non-presidential race in our nation's 250-year history. The previous Senate election in Ohio in 2022 saw Republican J.D. Vance enter the political arena. In that campaign, the party could work with Vance, but only to a certain degree. Federal law capped how much parties could spend in direct coordination with his campaign. The now Vice President of the United States went to federal court to challenge those limits, and this week, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled they violate the First Amendment.
This case is about the right of free speech of political parties.
Political parties could accept far more money from donors than individual candidates can. But until now, parties had a limited ability to use those war chests to work directly with campaigns, coordinating messaging, strategy, and spending. The original goal of these laws was to prevent mega donors from giving large sums to parties, knowing that money could then be spent to help a specific candidate.
Unlimited money equals corruption. If a single donor can give a large amount of money to a candidate, this is the equivalent of them purchasing influence.
Voters may start to see the ripple effects of this decision soon in the form of campaign ads on their TVs. Federal election law requires broadcasters to offer political candidates lower ad rates than outside groups, including super PACs and party committees. That means if party money can now be used more freely in coordination with candidates' campaigns, those advertising dollars can go further. A group of Democrats, including Sherrod Brown, are asking courts to prevent party money from being used to access those discounted candidate rates. Republican party groups have far more cash on hand than Democrats ahead of this year's midterms. But this ruling opens the door to more future spending from both parties and potentially more legal challenges to other campaign spending limits. And that's why it matters. Josh Croup, 13 Action News.